Welcome to Shift or Get Off the Pot, the podcast that helps you get out of your head and into action so you can make your dreams your reality. Let's get to it. Welcome to today's episode where I am joined by a woman, a coach, who doesn't just work with female entrepreneurs or ambitious professional women wanting to maybe change things or get to the next level in their career, but she works very specifically with Asian American women and helping them to break through generational cycles and break through that glass ceiling to pivot into a purposeful, aligned career. She is an award-winning journalist. She reached hundreds of thousands of readers in the former Fit for Life column for the Seattle Times. She has also formerly taught yoga. She taught yoga actually at the White House during the Easter egg roll during the Obama administration. She has been featured on the national TV show The List, as well as TV stations in Washington, D.C., Seattle, Sacramento, and Honolulu. And she is the author of 3 books, including the best-selling 24 Ways to Move More. And she's also working on a 4th book. So she is obviously highly ambitious herself. She is joining me today to really talk all about Asian American women and some of the challenges that they face, and more importantly, what they can do about those challenges and how they can break through them. So please welcome Nicole Tsong. Hi.
Hi, Kim. Thanks so much for having me.
I think it is fascinating that you work specifically with Asian American women because I, as an American, and I'm of Irish descent, but I just never realized that this subset of individuals have so many challenges in our workplace. So can you explain a little bit about that and what some of the challenges are that they face?
Sure. Well, I feel like, especially with Asian American women, there's always been, there's a couple of things that get in the way, I think, of them feeling like they can be fully themselves and fully expressed. And a lot of it is cultural and the way that they grow up. And so if you look at, most Asian cultures have a collective mentality where the group is really important. And so you're always like, it's about your family. It's about making sure that everyone is solid. And then when you come to America, like it's a very individualist culture and society here. It's all about, you're really kind of out for yourself here, take care of yourself, lift yourself up by your bootstraps, et cetera. And so when you're raised in that way, and like I was raised this way, where you don't even realize it's so subtle because it's happening all the time, but you don't really think about it. Like people would ask me like, oh, how did you get such good grades and go to such a good college, et cetera? And I was like, well, that was just always the expectation. Like there was no alternative option. And so that is one cultural pressure. I have 3 in the Asian pressure cycle that I work with Asian women on, but that's one specifically that often gets overlooked. And so then there's the other pieces of it, I think, are the, living in a society that says you're not enough. And we all live in this society, like consumerist culture, like you have to diet culture, like all of these things that are saying you're not enough, your body, your hair, your mind, any of that stuff. And then I would say the third piece of it is also just being a person of color in a society that's dominated by white people. And like that is just a real challenge that you're always trying to adapt, assimilate, make other people feel comfortable. And I would say Asian Americans in particular, I think because of the collectivist nature and that group nature that you grow up with, your tendency is to try to make everyone happy, including a culture that's not actually that welcoming or inviting for you all the time.
Great points, 3 great points. And I want to just comment on really one of those, maybe even 2, because they're a little bit universal in nature in that we're talking about group, right? Group mentality in a sense, but I understand that it is different because things are a little bit more individual in American society. When we grow up, it is more about, okay, you're doing things not so much in a group family environment. I mean, obviously our whole structure and our lifestyle is a little bit different, but there is still that desire to fit in. And that is somewhat universal. So is there something that you think that makes it a little bit more challenging for Asian American women?
Well, I would say it's a lot more challenging. I mean, first of all, America ranks like 90 percentile for individualist cultures. And so it's not, and then, I don't know the rating for most Asian societies, but they're Buddhist. And so they like have a Buddhist foundation, and it's very much about like the peace, calm, and collective nature of it. So I would say it's actually quite extreme in terms of the cultural differences. And you see it even like my family's Taiwanese, like you go back there, like people are way kinder to older people, for example. Like people actually will help you across the street. Like they just do things in ways. And here you were always like, oh, like we don't really think about them, or we try not to think about it too much. Like when parents are aging and things are going on, like it's just a really different mentality. And I'm not saying it's right or wrong. It's just different. And so when you come in, though, most kids, though, if you're raised with immigrant parents, they're still raising you in that style of the group, the collective is more important. So your family and their, you know, their pride and what they've done for you is more important than what you might want to do. So if you're thinking about doing something outside the norm, so the norm, like we always kind of joke about it, it's like doctor or lawyer, like that's the option because they're very secure jobs. They're very prestigious jobs. And even for me, like I was a journalist for a long time, and it wasn't a high paying job, but it was prestigious. So there's always like that quality of your choices are really framed by what would make your family proud. And so I think to me, that is quite a bit different because I think most people are trying to figure out like, what do I want to do? And like they want their own security or they want their own way to figure it out. But I think in particular, that's like the pressure that Asian American women in particular experience. And then it goes deeper, that other piece of it. I mean, growing up as a person of color, like you're constantly singled out. You spend your whole life being asked, what are you? Where are you from? And not in a kind way. Like typically, like I'll be like, I'm from Chicago because I was born and raised in Chicago. And they'll be like, no, where are you really from? Mm-hmm. And like being asked questions like that your entire life. And like, I'm not saying you can't overcome these things, but it can create programming of really feeling othered your entire life. And then now you go into corporate cultures, and then they're also expecting you to be loud and vocal and be yourself and like stand out. And especially for Asian American women, like when you're taught to be quieter, that is one stereotype, but that is one way it can come out, is that you're supposed to be a certain way. You're supposed to make sure everyone is good and happy. And then now you're being asked to stand out and force things that you've never really learned. It just can be a tougher battle. And it shows up in the statistics. Like I think there's like, of the workforce of leadership of women, only 3% are Asian. And there is, to me, like those facts, that's like a statistics that shows me factual issues in terms of cultural challenges for Asian American women to either stand out and or be recognized, and also systemic issues within corporate cultures.
I would never had thought that there'd be that much that would be different. And I guess I just would never think about it, obviously, probably because I'm not Asian American. So it just I didn't even, consider that. But when you bring that up, it makes complete sense. And especially when you talk about, obviously, even in the upbringing and being from a Buddhist background, right? So that in and of itself is quite different. And you're right, because now I can look at it with different eyes and from a different perspective and say, okay, that is quite different, because you're right. We are more inclined here to applaud the person that can find their voice, that can speak up, that can stand out. And I can easily understand how that's got to be so difficult, because you're kind of walking this tightrope. Like on one hand, I want to be this way. On the other hand, I'm trying to be this way. And you're one person out in the world, whereas you're another person probably at home. Or even, if we look at that metaphorically, even within your own self, and how that's got to create this conflict, just this incredible internal conflict. So forget about, like I talk a lot about self-beliefs and the self-doubt and the limiting beliefs that we all hold on to, but this is at a whole different level that you're talking about. Like this is a whole nother, I guess really this adds a whole nother layer on top of it that has to be challenging for people. So when you start to work with women that are either, let's say, professional women, and they are experiencing this, is it more that, are they aware of it consciously, do you think? Or is it more that they're like, wow, there's just kind of this discomfort or this disconnect, or I'm feeling out of sorts, what's really going on? Or do you think that they're just like so clearly aware that I have to be kind of these two different people?
I mean, it's like, I think any new client that you might get, like if you had a woman coming in who's white and perfectionist, like she might not understand. So perfectionism shows up for lots of women, I think, in general in corporate cultures. And then we have like the the Asian version of it, which is a little deeper. And like, I would just say it's deeper, but it doesn't show up per se any differently. And they're generally just aware. They're like, oh yeah, like I know I'm a total perfectionist, but it's more in the like, oh, but it's always gotten me to where I want to be. Like it's gotten me here. So I'm okay with it. Or like they might think I've worked on it. It's okay. So it's like they have a general understanding that it exists, but they might not understand the depth to which it does exist within them. And then also where they learned it from. Like they don't realize or recognize, like there's the joke and we like, I'll joke around with friends who are Asian, like, oh, you bring home an A and your parents are like, where's the A plus? And like that doesn't really occur in my experience with white American families. Like that's not typical, like that's not the standard. But in Asian families, it's a joke for a reason because there's a lot of parents who do it. And my parents didn't do it, but I definitely know people whose parents did do that. And so when you're like, okay, that standard is the reason your perfectionism exists. It's coming from family. It's coming from making your family proud. It's also coming from what you were taught as a kid, like the best is acceptable. And even then, even if you get an A plus, like they don't take you out to dinner to celebrate it. They're just like, finally, like you did it, as opposed to like, yay, like good job. Let's celebrate how awesome you are.
Yeah. It's more like it's about time.
Basically, like, good, that's what you're supposed to do. Yeah. And so it's more like that. And so when you look at that kind of pressure, so a lot of times, like, they understand the jokes about it and like they know that their families had high expectations. Like, there's a reason, like Asians are big in the workforce as like considered like very highly competent. So they're hired really well, but it's more like low level. So the level of leadership is really tough. Like, that's where I'm always looking at with Asian women. It's like, where is it that you're being challenged to do a higher level of leadership, but also sometimes doing something that's outside the norm. And that's where for a lot of women, they see me because like I was a yoga teacher, I'm an entrepreneur, like I'm not following a very traditional pathway. And
Right.
sometimes they really want to follow that. And it's hard for them to break out of it because of expectations from family, from culture. And so that's where we work to look at like what is getting in the way of you having those things in your life.
Well, and I would imagine it's not, I mean, obviously it's somewhat the limiting beliefs because all of that comes into play because of the family and the things that are
Right.
you're being shown or taught. And also though, the self-worth, like the self-worth has to be so wrapped up into achieving, just achieving and achieving and achieving and not ever truly understanding your true value as an individual.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's what, my podcast is a school of self-worth, and it's very much dedicated to that. And understanding that your worth and your value is not determined by what you do. It's not determined by your job. It's not determined by what your parents say about what you do. And that is the biggest piece for people to break. It's like, how can you determine self-worth independent of everybody else's perspectives on it, and then still also have a really positive relationship with your family? I think that can be really tough, especially when you're Asian. You're like, how do I have a good relationship with my parents, but not follow or fulfill the expectations that they might have of me? Like, I remember when I told my parents I wanted to leave my journalism job to be a yoga teacher. I was like, they're going to freak out. Like, I don't know how they're going to handle this. And my parents have always been very supportive, and they were actually totally fine. They're just like, if you know what you're doing, you're fine, and then they're like also very supportive. Yeah, they were super supportive, and they're always like, if you need money, let me know, because they're worried that I was going to go broke in that situation. But, I think it is challenging for us to be like, when we're starting to step outside the grain. And I think this is true of anyone, like, taking a pathway that's not been walked before. The human brain hates it. It wants you to stay safe and comfortable. And there's just can be other components of like, how do you navigate the relationship with your family? In the case of a lot of Asian families, it's like, how do you navigate that while still forging your own pathway? And that's a lot of what I teach and help them with.
I think that again, going back to universal truths, because I do think that there are a lot of people that perhaps are not Asian American that do suffer with some of that too, and that their parents do expect something else, right? They expect them to be, I mean, I know my dad's parents expected him to be a doctor or a lawyer. Like those were the things that, were acceptable. And then watching him go to school and study and study and study for all that, and then finally just say, I am not doing this anymore, and break away from all of that. but it was easier it was difficult, yes, because he knew he was disappointing his parents, but at the same time, it was easier because culturally he did not have what you're talking about, where you have your whole, not just your mom and dad, but you have, it's generational, right? It's really so deeply embedded. And I think that's the thing that is so fascinating to me that I just would never have thought of before, because we're not just talking about, okay, the self-worth and the limiting beliefs and wanting to do something. You're really talking about this whole other layer that I imagine has got to be just that much more difficult to really navigate through that and be able to say, okay, I'm ready. So I'm curious, do you find that more and more women are kind of standing up and saying, enough, I'm like done, I'm so ready to create my own path or my own life? Or do you feel like they're like still kind of struggling and holding back?
I mean, I would just say it depends on the person. Like, it really depends on the person and where they're at. And then just even going back to what you were talking about, I would say the other piece, though, that I think that social media has really helped with this piece of it is this newer and deeper understanding. I'm seeing more and more that, so most Asian American immigrants are children, have had some very traumatic, usually war-based experience in their lives. And so one of the commonalities I find for if your parents immigrated over here is that your parents probably were escaping some kind of either experienced war, lived in war, or getting out of it. And so I think more and more these days, people are having more compassion for their parents, that their parents didn't have therapy. They didn't go through anything to help them understand like the trauma that they experienced, and that you as their child are actually, you know, still inheriting some of those things. And then also coping with like they're wanting you to thrive. And part of the reason they care so much about it is because they had so much difficulty for themselves. And so one of the things I think that's coming up more and more is people are aware of that. They're starting to understand that they're, instead of being mad that their parents don't understand the choices that they're making, because you're growing up fully American, you're just like, oh, like that's hard for them to understand. Like it was really difficult. Like my parents both lived through war, you know? And so when you think about like you're as a child, like being occupied, like living in a country that's occupied, like my mom, and there's a totally foreign language being taught in school because Japan occupied Taiwan until she was pretty like 5 or 6. I can't remember the exact time. And then, you know, having to transition back to your own culture, like you think about that, like, you know, it's a lot. That is just really a lot. And I think to me, that awareness is much higher than it used to be. So whether breaking out of things, I don't know, but I think that that understanding and compassion for parents is higher.
I would think that, you know, culturally, it's so different because, you know, as you're saying, you have to take a look at what's been going on in the home country, right? And what the past experience is. And like you're saying, you know, maybe they had come from war times. Maybe they had their land occupied. And it takes a very, I believe, very mature and confident person to kind of look back at that and say, oh my gosh, if I could put myself in their shoes and feel what they're feeling and understand from that perspective, because that can kind of change the game. It takes you out of pointing the finger and being someone that just blames, you know, your past for where you're probably at right now. And it kind of shifts your perspective on things. And I think that's so important because it really can then help you open yourself up to making some changes and shifts in your life.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that, again, like I said, there's so much more awareness of it. And that to me is always the first step. And so if you're recognizing, it took me years, I mean, into adulthood to start to realize, I was like, wow, my parents actually, things were pretty tough. Like there's stories you grow up with and you hear about, but when you're a kid, like you don't really understand the depth of what that experience might have been like. And then when you get older and you start to unpack those things, you're like, wow, like that actually was tough. Like they really have made my life, they are so focused on me being happy and good and secure and having a job that makes good money and has healthcare, because they grew up in a lot of insecurity. They grew up with a lot of real deep challenge. And so when you can start to see that, like they want you to thrive for those reasons, I think it enables you to have like a healthier relationship with it. And again, get out of any blame or anger towards how they might have raised you, to compassion and understanding. And then that's actually just so much more powerful a place to come from, instead of being like, that was a limitation. And in fact, it's actually a strength. It's a power. Like, wow, my parents survived so much. And now they've enabled me to have a really beautiful life. And how can I support them? How can I love them? How can I make sure that they have a really great experience of being parents and now that they're aging.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it too, and turning it around instead of seeing it as maybe a liability or a limiting belief, and turning it around and saying, okay, this is really a strength. And this is something that obviously is part of me. And what my real heritage is knowing that, okay, my parents were able to come through this, and therefore I can pretty much overcome anything too. I'd love to understand though what you're seeing with Asian American women in the workplace, professional women, because you did mention earlier that most of them it's easy for them to get hired, but then again, it's a lower entry position. It's not someone in leadership. And so what does that look like in the professional arena as far as leadership or management roles go?
I think it's just harder for them to get promoted to the highest levels. Like there's very few, like I can't name anyone off the top of my head, but there's just very few in like C-suite, for example, or VP level. Like there are just not as many women who are advancing to that level. I typically find a lot of my women are managers and often have a team, but getting to director or above, like that's when it starts to get more challenging. And then all the advice they're getting is like, oh, speak up more, be louder, be more assertive. And it's, again, that very individualistic culture kind of advice. But then for them, often what's happening is like they are feeling blocked in it because they're typically very hardworking. Like they will totally get everything done for you and you can trust them to get it done. But being seen as anything other than the workhorse is where the challenges starts to come up. So for them, a lot of it is around understanding what is my authentic voice? Am I doing something because I just learned that I was supposed to be quiet and that's how it's supposed to go? Or sometimes you can be super aggressive. Like there's different, they're human, like they have so many different qualities around it, but there can also be, I think that there's also some systemic stuff that's going on as well for people to start to put into practice in corporate cultures to recognize people who they might not typically have thought of as someone who could be a leader. So I think, but I work with women really on like, where can you start to embody your own power in that? And so where do you start to look at programs that you learned when you were a kid? How do you start to step out of those systems to say, okay, like, let me be myself fully? And then sometimes for my women, a lot of it is like, actually, I don't want to be in corporate culture. Like it's time for me to pivot and go somewhere else or do something different. And that this is not the place for me.
And so you find that more and more of them are shifting into entrepreneurs, becoming entrepreneurs?
I would say that, entrepreneurship is like a pretty special place. I don't know that all of them are shifting into entrepreneurship, but a lot of them are shifting into jobs that are more fulfilling for them or things that they might, more creative or something that's like outside sort of the typical corporate culture. And so sometimes they stay in corporate. And I always want to say, like, it's not like anything is wrong with it. If it's where you want to stay, right, you feel fulfilled. Some people are really passionate about the work that they're doing and they're happy to stay there. But a lot of them sometimes are like in a place of, well, there's something else out there for me. Like, this is not the place for me to be. There's something else for me to do. And then that shift, I also help them with that.
So it's recognizing and understanding what really that inner passion is.
Yes.
Wants to do something else, something more.
Yes, exactly.
And that, I would imagine, though, still, it has that other layer, though, within it, that it's kind of like, okay, wait a minute, my parents want me to do this. And again, I think, yes, you see some of that in other cultures as well. But I think what you're saying is that, especially because of the background, the sense of group, the community, et cetera, and family, it is very prevalent, very strong within the Asian community. And I think that's got to be kind of a difficult thing to really break away from mentally, because I can see that maybe maybe you find this, that people can break away from it physically, right? I'm going to go and do this. But do you find that there's that conflict that just kind of they almost keep butting heads with their own self because they're trying to break free of that?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's really common to maybe make the decision, break free, but then still struggle with it. Mm-hmm. And then if you're not doing well in entrepreneurship, is like a whole long road, and the beginning can be pretty challenging. And so if you're feeling like you're not succeeding or you're, like what's happening with that can just become like you said, I would say for most women, more of an internal conflict than a real one. Cause I think that most parents love you and they might be critical. Like not out of the question. I see that a lot as well. But just being able to navigate, what do you want, and being really clear on that. And I think a lot of times the real trouble and challenge is that they've done things that other people want versus what they really want. But I find this is also, again, universal. Most people don't really know what they want. And so then they just sort of are in reaction all the time into life versus being in that choice place of like, no, this is actually what I want to do. I'm going to be really clear in that choice. And I always would say for myself, like when every time I did that, my parents were very supportive. And I think that anytime you come into that place where you're clear and you know what you want and you know what's going to make you happy, like ultimately family does support it. Like they might be concerned or worried about your welfare, or all of those pieces. But I think sometimes it can be much more built up in your head.
Do you find that most people really even take the time to figure out what they want? Because what I have found is that most people, like you said, are not clear on what they want. It's very easy for them to say what they don't want.
Yeah, for sure.
But it's more that they won't even take the time to figure that out.
Yeah, I think that most people don't take the time because they don't really see that there's an alternative to current life. Our brains are always trying to keep us safe. Your brain likes, they know what your day looks like. They knows how much money you're going to make. It knows, exactly like when you're going to the grocery store on the weekend, like your brain is just like in these patterns and grooves. And so stepping outside of that groove can be very challenging. It's like I am a cross country skier, and I always think about it. It's like, you have the tracks when you're skiing, and learning to step out of those tracks is like really scary. Like your brain doesn't want you to do it. It's like, stay in the groove, stay in the track. But I would say, when you start to the pain has to kind of be so deep. And I typically find for most people, like they're utterly miserable, like rock bottom is usually the point at which they'll step out of the groove, because it just takes that much for us, because our brain wants us to be comfortable, wants us to be happy.
Yeah. Or they sabotage. They create something that sabotages things for them so that they have no choice then. It's kind of like, oh, now you have to do something.
Yeah. Or like your body totally rebels. I've had many stories of people with like rock bottom health issues, and then that's the only time they made the change.
Oh, interesting. But that is true, because your body is the telltale sign. It will
always tell you what's going on. I've heard so many stories of women who've had just like total health crises. And then that health crisis is the reason they made the change.
Yeah. I've heard that too. What do you think for yourself? What helped you become, or were you always very clear? I mean, you said you made a couple of different changes and such.
Yeah.
But were you clear, at least on do you feel like you were clear early on what you wanted to do, but then you kind of took different paths to get there?
No, Kim, I was definitely not clear. I mean, I feel like I picked journalism because I was a comp lit major. I was a comparative literature major. So I was like, okay, be a writer. And then it seemed prestigious. Like that was really ultimately why. And it was actually a really good career for me, because I was a curious person, and you're really expected to be curious, and I got to write, and I liked all of those pieces. But I don't actually know that journalism was ever really what I ultimately wanted to do. It's what I thought I should do. And then once I got into the career, I was into it and I became good at it. But no, I had a pretty intense experience when I was a journalist in Alaska at the time, and they had put me on Catholic sex abuse as a big project. And so it was very prestigious. I was like, oh, this is like everything you ever want when you're a young journalist. But then, of course, like covering such an intense topic is like the norm in journalism. So that was hard enough as it was. But then a year after that project came out and we won all these awards, I was like really proud of myself. One of my sources died by suicide. And so that was like a very traumatic experience for me as a young journalist. And that was the first time I went to therapy, because like I just didn't understand how to deal, because it was so difficult. And then after that, that was the first time I started to feel like this isn't for me, but I didn't really know how to cope because I had put all my energy into this career. And so I just switched. I started doing politics. I ended up covering home and garden. I covered the suburbs. Like I did all these things to switch. But then journalism itself was going through its first rough years with the downturn and the recession. And so they were laying off a lot of people. I didn't get laid off, but the stress of the layoffs really was like making me rethink, like, what do I want to do? And so during that time, the only thing I liked in my life was yoga. And so I went to a yoga teacher training. And during that time, that's the first time I started to really get tuned in with my body and understanding that there were things that I wanted that I didn't even recognize previous to that time. Like at that time, all I knew is I didn't want to be in journalism, but it wasn't giving me a direction. I didn't really understand how to figure out what I wanted until the trainings. And then that training is where I started to really tune in and understand I had an intuition. Started to understand that there was guidance for me that was outside of what I typically had always done before. And then I started to follow it. And so that was my really first big moment of knowing what I wanted, which was to be a full-time yoga teacher. By the way, super impractical, no healthcare, no time off, like none of those security things I had
different.
Looked for. Yeah. I was on my own. I was a contractor working for all these different studios, but it was the first thing I knew that I wanted for real. That was true to me. And so I did it and I left. So that was my first big leap.
That is a big leap. That is completely different than what you were doing. And like you said, independent contractor, no real security and such. But I think it's interesting that you bring up intuition because, man, I tell you, if we all knew just how powerful our intuition is, and if we could all learn at a young age, and some people do, some people get that from their parents or they're born into a family where they really respect that. But if you could understand just the power of the intuition and what it can do for us, because that's a game changer, I think. So I love that you brought up intuition because you feel like that's kind of led you to where you are now, trusting or following your intuition.
Oh, absolutely. I feel like everything, I didn't at the time probably understand intuition that well, but I understood the intuitive hit to go teach yoga. And then after that, I met one of my teachers who's been a big mentor to me. And then I started to actually understand intuition on a much deeper level, which is what I coach essentially now for a lot of women. It's like, how do you access it? Because most of us seem to think it's like this mystical woo thing that's like hard to access versus understanding there are systematic ways to learn it. And so I learned it. And then that's how I started to get all of the things that have happened. Like my book deals came from intuitive hits. Like I was working for a big yoga company and the intuitive hit was like, leave that yoga company. Again, leave the security. It was my healthcare. It was like all of those things. And it said, write a book. And I didn't have an agent. I didn't even understand how to write a proposal. I didn't even have an idea. I just was like, it was like, leave your job. And so I left my job and then I was like, what am I doing? I'm just like teaching yoga and like Googling how to write a book, how to do any of these things. But 4 months after I left that job, I got an email from a local publisher who was reading me in the paper. And they said, hey, like, do you want to write 2 yoga books for us? And so that was how I got my first book deals. But to me, like that's how intuition is. It's like you have to trust it before you have the answer, which is the worst for your brain. Like your brain absolutely hates it. Like that security did not exist at all. It does not exist with intuition. But once I did that, and then I got that book deal, those first 2 book deals, I started to realize there was so much power to following it. And then that's why I teach it so frequently, because that is it. Like that intuitive leap is the source of so much of the fulfillment, purpose, and, insight that my women are often looking for.
I think it's something that a lot of people are looking for, not just maybe your women, but I think it's something that so many of us have just tucked away and not paid attention to, or we get, like you said, an intuitive hit, but then we don't act on it. We don't pay attention to it because like it's hard to. It really is. I mean, you kind of go, oh, I'm going to leave this. Wait, what? I'm leaving this and I'm supposed to just figure out how to write a book. Wait, what's going on? I mean, anybody outside would look at that and think, what is she doing now? Like, really? And I think that's the battle that I have seen for a lot of people to deal with, because it's almost one of those things you don't really want to talk about, but at the same time, it's the thing that's really leading you forward and helping you to achieve maybe your next level of success. But I think it's hard for people to really show themselves that they have faith in trusting that by stepping out in action. So I applaud you for doing that, because that's not an easy thing. And you just kind of go, okay, where's this going to lead me? What's going to happen here? But do you feel like when you got those intuitive hits, did it feel like, I've heard people say it's like, oh, I got this download. And I used to walk around and go, I want to download, not knowing that I was having a download, but I just didn't call it that way, right? Or do you feel like for you, and for everybody, it's a little bit different. Like for me, if I ask a question and I need an answer, it's like a flashcard right in front of my head. I'm very visual and I'll see the answer or which way to go kind of written out on it. And some people hear it, they hear it, like it's somewhere where they're just either a sense or they actually physically, not, yeah, I guess physically kind of hear something like a voice talking to them. What did you feel? Did you feel like it was just like, oh, I just have this sense of knowing I should do this?
Well, I would say I'm auditory, so I hear answers. So I'm similar to you. Like I ask questions and then I hear answers, and it's always very clear. Like I hear a word, and I wouldn't say like I hear a voice, but like I hear a word in my head, and then I always like know that that is the answer for it. But everyone is a little different. Some people like see visual visions, like they see the picture in front of them, and then that's their intuition. And then some people, it's like body sensations are telling you that intuitive hits. And so for me, it's always like understanding. But I feel like the biggest challenge for most people around intuition is understanding what is intuition and what is not, because we're so used to hearing all this talk in our head, and we think that that is real. And a lot of what I teach is learning to distinguish between the two.
That is such an important point, because I would consider myself a very intuitive person. There were a lot of things that I saw and knew well before family members that were injured or something was coming up, or things that I would see ahead of time, mostly with family members or very close friends, right? And I honestly think a lot of that happened because when I was a child, I had chronic ear infections. And so I kind of learned to go within. And I think that kind of helped. But, over the years, there were times where I just kind of ditched it. I pushed it aside and was like, and I started just going down this other road. Like, okay, I need to do this. And this is how the real world operates. And you're supposed to get this degree and do this and all those kinds of things. And then at some point, something brings you back to it. And I'm grateful for that. But I do find that there were times, and I'm much better about it now, but there are times that I would get a sense or an answer and I would say, are you sure? You know what I mean? Like I'd challenge it, because I'd be like, oh my gosh, kind of like, if someone said, if I felt this, you need to quit this and go out and start, taking this road now, I might be like, wait, what? Are you sure that's the way you want me to go? I don't know if that's the answer I want. And then I would ask again and again and again until finally it was like this, okay, there's no denying it now. You find that you've ever done that where you just kind of go, really?
Oh, yeah. All the time. I'm always like, are you sure? That seems hard. That's what I always say. I'm like, that one seems hard. Why should I do that? That seems super hard. I think about like that period before I got the book deal. Like it sounds great now, but when it was happening, it was like Tuesday was my writing day, and I would sit there and I would stress out. I would write things. I took a writing class, and then I was like not making any money because I had quit the job. And I was like, what am I doing? Like, how long is this going to take? I don't know how you do these things. I was just feeling very hopeless for a lot of it, but I also trusted that I had made the right choice because I needed to leave that job. And then the answer came through, and it is often like that. There's this whole period where you get the intuitive hit, and it is followed very closely by fear and doubt. Mm-hmm. Like I always think of them as this 1-2 punch. And so when I'm in that fear and doubt place, I'm like, oh, this is normal. This is what happens. I heard what to do, but because I've never done this, because this is hugely scary, like writing a book is a huge amount of effort, and I had never done it. I had no idea how to do it. It was going to be hard because I had to learn how to do it. Whereas now I understand at least the process of it. So when it's hard, I'm like, okay, this is like an expected hard versus a scary, I've never done this before hard.
Yeah. Writing a book proposal is hard, let alone the book.
Oh yeah,
is a whole nother level. I learned that. I'm like, wait, what? Didn't know there was this much involved in it. So it gets a little bit crazy. I found out not just writing the chapters, but yes, there's so much that goes into a book proposal. So I can imagine just kind of leaving, going, I've got to step out. I got to take action. I got to go this. That's a lot. What would you say is really kind of the one thing that maybe you could, if you'd like to, leave readers with that helps, or leave listeners with that helps them to understand what the difference is between what is intuition, listening to that intuition, and what is just your own mental chatter?
Yeah, well, if you're questioning it and you're not sure if it's mental chatter or intuition, I recommend first going to do something to clear your mind and your body. So go on a walk, go outside, breathe some fresh air. If you have any practices, like take dance to a good song, and then listen. And you'll notice there's a distinct difference between the voices that speak before you do that and the voice after. And then when you start to know the difference, that is really helpful. And sometimes that's not enough, but that's one first way. Change your state and then see what you hear.
I love that. I think, just getting up and moving can shift that energy. Psychologists tell us that moving actually helps us to get into that access that part of the mind that helps us to be able to solve a problem even. So I would imagine just helping you to open your mind up to hear that intuition, that intuitive voice. And also I think just being able to be present, like you're saying, go outside, take a walk, listen to music, something else that kind of helps you to get centered rather than just listening to all that other stuff going on. How would you define success?
How do I define success? I feel like success for me for a long time was very external based. It was based on what other people thought or said or did. And now for me, success is very internal. Like how do I feel? And to me, success is very closely tied to growth. So while I look probably as ambitious and probably even more than I did in my early years of my career, I feel like that ambition is not based on external factors. When I am stretching in my business or with a new book or in my personal life, it's never because that outcome is going to give me something. It's because I'm stretching for the growth that I'm going to experience along the way. And so to me, success is always about the growth rather than what I get at the end of it.
I love that. It's a process. It's a journey. Mm-hmm. What is the fourth book? Because you're working on a fourth book right now.
Yeah. So it's actually based on self-worth related to dating and relationships. So I got divorced a few years ago, was dating in my 40s. And so the book is very much about that journey and that experience and what I learned along the way, and then how to help people do the same. Like, how do you have self-worth when you're dating and looking for your next partner?
So important. I mean, self-worth is at the heart of just about everything, right? Everything that we do, how we're showing up in the world, how we're showing up for ourselves, the choices that we make, and really just how we either go forward in life or how we stay and hold ourselves back in that fear and that doubt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And that was such a big journey. I feel like any pathway of growth is a personal development journey, essentially. And so in that particular one, I went through a really big one when it came to dating. And then I think there's so many different ways we can do it. But I always love that challenge of like, okay, you're not really feeling in your power in this particular setting in your life. Like, how can you start to learn to step into it?
Yeah. Yeah. How can you step into it? That's an important point. I love that. How can you shift that energy and how can you step into it? You are doing great work in the world. I think, it's just truly opened my eyes to that there's such a cultural difference that I just was not even aware of and I think just kind of took for granted, never really thought about it. But for Asian American women and understanding that, yes, some of these challenges are universal, but again, I think it's got that whole other layer of it that is something that truly does need to be addressed and something that needs to be looked at so that you can break that generational cycle. So thank you for that. Nicole, how can people get a hold of you?
Yeah, so you can find me at NicoleTsong.com. I'm on Instagram at Nicole Tsong. I've been spending a lot of time on TikTok lately, so if you're a TikToker, head there for Nicole Tsong _ and you can find me there as well.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for the work that you are doing in the world.
Thank you so much, Kim, for having me.
Thanks so much for joining me here today. If you want some help achieving your goals, you can grab the success bundle that is linked down below, or you can join the challenge that I have coming up. The challenge is designed to help you align with your goals, get out of your head, get into action so you can achieve what it is that you say you want. You have the ability. Let's just get going and get it done. I'll be back again soon with another episode of Shift or Get Off the Pot.